stuck in lesson 3 for a little while, as I said before, and looking around. There's a lot of stuff to look around at in God's creation. I don't know if you know that. There's a lot of stuff to look around at. So we may be parked here till the double digits. Hopefully not the triple digits, but we'll see how it goes. Last week, if you missed it, it's on the back side of these notes. Last week, we saw evidence from curious plants that confirm the biblical worldview and conflict with the evolutionary models. Today's lesson will look at how observable science with regard to plant origins challenges the evolutionary model and how evolutionists respond to the challenges. So, if you can think back with me, if you've been reading the morning devotionals that Pastor Kim and Pastor Edmund had put out, on Friday, June 11th, we were in 1 Samuel 5. I wrote this down that same day, and it's taken me this long to get it worked into the lesson. Okay, 1 Samuel 5, we read about the story of the Philistine priests who took the Ark of the Covenant and put it before their statue of their false god Dagon. And when they came back, not only did their false god fall down before the Ark, eventually he fell down and his head and hands were shattered, right? The Philistines, at this point, could have looked at the evidence, key word here, and concluded the truth, that there is only one all-knowing, all-powerful, true God, and it isn't theirs. And they could have converted to worshiping the one true God, Yahweh, the God of Israel. But instead, they stubbornly changed their false religion to compensate for the discovery that they had made. Pastor wrote in that study, when men create a God after their own imagination, then men can adapt and reinvent the worship of it to suit the circumstances. Man has been doing this since the beginning, and he continues to do it in a way that applies to our study of biblical creationism. Staunch evolutionists, when faced with evidence that refutes their religious narrative, either ignore that evidence or simply change the narrative. And they move the goalposts, if you will, right? They're changing the rules on the fly. As we've discussed before, Christians do the same thing. When they irrationally try to adapt or redefine the biblical record to try to marry it up with either evolution or any other contrivance of sinful man that justifies his delinquency. But as Pastor also wrote in that devotion, God only blesses those who refuse to move the ancient landmarks and who walk in the old paths. Good morning. Come right in, right on time. So, when we look at... It's a great car. It's a great car. I thought we were here. Boom, got it. Evidence from plant origins. Okay. So my first question would be, did plants evolve? Evolution claims that plants descended from algae as they colonized the empty landmass. So algae was growing in the water, and at some point and somehow, this plant, it doesn't have all of these structures, came out of the water and became this, and then colonized all of land and diversified. Because as we discussed in week 1, good morning. As we discussed in week 1, I see it, man, I see it. With evolution, it has everything to do with previous forms bringing about new forms, right? Everything is a descent from one form to another form. So nothing, according to evolution, should have originated on its own without descending from something else. And their story is that the algae in the water became the plants on land. But by contrast, the Bible describes the creation of different kinds of plants on the same day in Genesis 1. Amen? The creation of plants in their the creation of plants in their many diverse forms is apparent in the intricate designs of plants, as we've seen in the last lesson, and of plant systems, and also in something we'll cover later, symbiotic relationships that could not have evolved in gradual processes over millions of years. In case you didn't know, they have diagrams called phylogenetic trees. That's in your notes there. Phylogenetic trees supposedly outline the path of evolution from one kind of plant to all the other kinds of plants. Yet, this evolutionary sequence, which is one of the most popular for plant types, this is actually a simplified version of a phylogenetic tree. In the real ones, they use their full Latin names. But this is instead a common, well-known word for that whole category, right? So mushrooms is definitely not what the category is named. It's the full Latin name, but by saying mushrooms, you probably understand that better when looking at this. So this is a simplified phylogenetic tree that attempts to explain the history of plants. The problem is that this evolutionary sequence is not found anywhere in the fossil record. The only place it exists is in the fairy tales of textbooks, like this. I couldn't fit this all in your notes, so I didn't try. But these are really common textbooks across the world that mention on these cited pages all of these facts, according to evolution facts, that plants appear as fossils over 400 million years ago. Plants evolved from green algae, as we showed in that last picture, and invaded the vacant land. Many adaptations were needed as plants moved from water onto land. That's a fact. If plants moved from water to land, many adaptations would be needed. Many symbiotic relationships, according to the textbooks, evolved to support plants on land. Then, early forests were dominated by giant ferns and cycads that formed the fossil fuels, the coal beds and the oil and all that. Those were then replaced by seed plants, according to evolution. Then the first fossils of vascular plants, that would be leaves that have vein systems flowing through them to transport minerals from the ground up into the rest of the plant. Vascular plants occurred not until 375 million years ago. Then the first fossil seed plants occur at 360 million years ago, as seed plants replace ferns and cycads. And hopefully you realize, replace ferns, but we still have ferns. So that should be a bell. Flowering plants evolve slowly and appear later in the fossil record at 130 million years. And then, another thing in several of these textbooks is that bristlecone pines in the Rocky Mountains are the oldest known organisms at around 4,700 years old. Okay, so this leaves us with a lot of questions. Since grass, according to this method, is not supposed to have evolved until, what did I say, 400 million years ago? Well after all the dinosaurs died? Why do we have dinosaurs, why do we have fossilized dinosaur dung that contains grass? Why has pollen been found in rocks that are classified as Precambrian, an era that is well before the earliest plants were supposed to have evolved on Earth? How do scientists explain the fact that not one individual tree has been confirmed to be dated at more than around 4,500 years old? At least 4 in this chart, at least 4 different evolutionary lines are supposed to have emerged from prehistoric green algae, the common ancestor of all plants. So why has not a single fossil been found or provided to support that matter? Not one. All the works that contain these kinds of phylogenetic diagrams of charts, none of them show photos or even artistic renderings of fossils that are in a sequence. Individually, one fossil, but not fossil sequences. Okay? The grand claims made by evolutionary botanists are laced with words like probably, apparently, and presumably. The lack of fossil ancestors for these major groups would seem to be important to those of us that are just reading the evidence. But the evolutionists fill in the gaps with imagination instead of science. The evidence, as we'll see, clearly points to diverse groups created in supernatural events described in Genesis 1. And I think we've kind of beat that out, so let's go to another question. What about adaptation? This is a big key word. Everybody throws out, oh, adaptation. You can't deny adaptation. I don't try to deny adaptation. Adaptation is common ground for creationists and evolutionists. It's the only thing we can observe in science. So, from this textbook's perspective, they use the word adaptation, right, to, where does it say? Yeah. So algae is supported by the surrounding water, and whole algae, or whole alga, a single one, performs photosynthesis, absorbs water, CO2, and minerals from the water. And then somehow it becomes a plant that has roots, right? It's in two different environments. This is only in water, this is in the air, and in the ground. And so the stem and the leaves and the root systems and the reproductive systems all supposedly somehow adapted from the algae. Evolutionists like to point to observable evidence of adaptation, right? We recognize adaptation in skin color, in height, in strength, in the beak length of a bird, right? We recognize those adaptations, but they try to use that information that's observable to extrapolate evidence for the whole evolutionary model. All the new features that would be needed to transition from algae to vascular plants would have required new information to code that production. And as we've stated before, there is no known mechanism that can consistently provide new information through random mutation to the genome of any individual organism. Random mutation cannot produce new information consistently enough to change one kind of thing to another kind of thing. But that's what evolution stands on. Also, while plants do have many adaptations that allow them to be successful on land, there's no proof or evidence either that those adaptations could have come through long gradual evolutionary processes. The many features that allow plants to thrive in a diverse environment were programmed into those different plant kinds when they were created by God. That's what the Bible says. The view of adaptation is a key difference in the evolution and creation models. We both use the word and we view it differently. So let's see from a creation view, what would we call adaptation? That should be in your notes. A physical trait or behavior due to, my emphasis added, inherited characteristics that gives an organism the ability to survive in a given environment. From a creationist perspective, the information is already there. It is inherited genetically, and it's employed when it needs to be. It is not added by random mutation because of necessity. Because as we said, random mutation cannot add information. It only takes away. In evolutionary biology, adaptations are often acquired by modifying existing structures to accomplish new tasks. In the case of the algae, this here, this. In the case of the algae turning into the plant, the pre-existing structures are just not there. It's a very simple organism with no real ability to have differentiated tissues that, like stem cells or things that can be used or adapted to a new use, right? To get around this, some evolutionists suggest that fungi invaded the plant's ecosystems to assist them in absorbing nutrients. While there is much evidence of plants and fungi living in symbiotic relationships today, there's no evidence, observable or in the fossil record, that suggests that they evolved to help each other. They just made it up. Imagination fills in the gaps. Some point to a new weed species that was recently discovered in Britain. And the new species was found later to be actually a hybrid of two existing species. Okay? The fact that a new species of plants can form as a result of the mixing of existing genes is not evidence for molecules to man evolution, but it is evidence for creation. Because no new information is generated. You shuffle two decks of cards together, you had the information at the beginning that you shuffled together. Nothing new has been added. Even if you duplicate two decks of one kind of card, you haven't added new information because you can learn nothing new from duplicated information. You can't add more information simply by duplication or cloning, if you will. But from the creationist model, we've already said that plants were created to reproduce after their kind. So this evidence of the hybridization of two species, it can point to the fact that because they interbreed, they must have been part of the same original kind, right? We see the same thing with wolves and dogs, right? We would say there was a dog kind that diversified as information was lost into all these several species that we see today. But the fact that a wolf and a domesticated dog can breed means they were originally part of the same kind, right? So, even though these weeds are raised up in the media as an example of evolution in action, they fail to show how dramatic changes like the algae to plants story of the evolutionary past can take place. Again, extrapolating the small information-losing mutations to explain information gaining major changes is bad science. It's bad science. The two are not connected at all. So another question here is, what about transitional forms? Has anyone ever heard this term before? Yeah. Transitional forms? So Darwin and many other evolutionists since him have postulated that if evolution were true, we would expect to find millions of fossils all over the world of forms of organisms in differing stages of evolution between one kind of thing and another kind of thing. Darwin actually said that should be the preponderance of fossils. That should be the majority of the fossils we find are the interspecial forms. He said in his time after he wrote his two books, but we don't see that. And he said it's probably just because we're failing as geologists. Right. So we've not found any evidence for plants or animals that are in these, that can be confirmed to be in these transitional periods. The Archaeopteryx is one of the probably four that they hold up as the most profoundly factual. There's no way you can argue it that this is a transitional fossil. However, there is still argument. This was discovered in 1861, only 2 years after Darwin wrote his book. And since then, there's been all kinds of discussion about whether some of these markings are feathers or are they other kinds of structures, right? So the thing is, you can only learn so much from dead bones. And you can only convince so many people that your artistic extrapolations from dead bones are accurate. But the sheer lack of even if we say this is a transitional form, like I said, this is one of like maybe four that they hold up, right? The lack of additional evidence when we have hundreds of thousands of fossils of organisms, both plant, fish, animal, in stable forms with no evidence of transitioning. That would lead most of us to think maybe transitioning between forms is not what happens. So the sheer lack of transitional organisms in the fossil record did not lead evolutionists to accept the creation model as one would hope. Instead, as we opened with, it led them to imagine the idea of punctuated equilibrium. This was an idea championed by Stephen Jay Gould, who was the famous atheist genealogist and paleontologist of Harvard University in the 70s. And this idea is that evolutionary changes do not tend to take place gradually and continually in the main population over long periods of time, but in relatively short bursts in small, isolated populations, which will therefore be less likely to be fossilized. It's a very convenient theory thrown out at the last minute, but this notion would not have had to have been invented if not for the fact that the fossil record conflicts with the prediction of Darwin and other evolutionists. Prominent Stephen Jay Gould himself, who was part of this in 1977, wrote, "The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks, like that one that I showed, have data only at the tips and nodes of the branches. In any local area, a species does not arise gradually by the gradual transformation of its ancestors. It appears, wait for it, all at once and fully formed." That sounds familiar to me. It sounds familiar to me. It sounds an awful lot like the creation model, that animals and plants appeared all at once and fully formed. In the fossil record, the major groups of plants appear suddenly and fully formed. The transitional species are not present at all, especially with regard to plants. To explain the amazing complexity of what they refer to as the most evolved plants, or flowers, right? Angiosperms is the technical term. They claim that evolutionary forces have modified all of the leaves and other simple mechanisms into petals and sepals and anthers and ovaries and other flower structures over vast ages. Time is the key to evolution. If you don't see a way, just add more time and it'll all work. This claim is made even though there's no fossil evidence for the changes, and flowering plants appear, as you probably guessed, fully developed in the fossil record. Fully developed. There's no evidence of inter-transitional forms. Okay, so all of this evidence for us points back to the creation model and the fact that plants are observed both in the present and in the fossil record, reproducing in pre-programmed limits after their kind, just like the Bible teaches. So what about old plants? We brought this up with the Rocky Mountain, Rocky Mountain bristlecone pines, oldest known organism in the world. Now, recently, a group of Huon pines in Tasmania was claimed as the oldest living organism. They dated this at 10,500 years, a group of what seemed like cloned trees. It was a group of trees instead of one tree, but it was all part of the same DNA, so probably something happened, they were growing separate. But they claimed this was 10,500 years old, and the media bastioned it as, proof of evolution, all those silly creationists and their flood views. Come to find out, because from our perspective, it's not possible that, as we see here with creation, corruption, catastrophe, right, the timeline of the biblical record, according to a creationist, a young earth creationist, it's not possible that anything on earth could be older than around 4,500 years old, because that's when the catastrophe of the flood would have likely removed all vegetation from the surface of the earth. The age of this group of trees was actually not determined by ring count, as we typically, every kid in elementary school knows, you count the number of rings in the tree, and that's generally about how many. There are drought years where it doesn't have a ring, and there are surplus years where it might have 2 rings, but generally, that's about the number of years of the age of the tree. This group of trees was actually dated by the presence of pollen drilled from a nearby lake. So, traditional tree ring dates give ages of no more than 4,000 years for these same trees, which lines up with creation and not with evolution.
Yeah.
Traditional tree ring dates for the oldest bristlecone pines in the Rocky Mountains have about 4,600 rings, putting them as the oldest living organisms and fitting with the biblical model of the timeline. The fact that the ages, well, this is Rocky Mountain bristlecone pines. Really funky looking trees. But if you've been around for 4,000 years, you probably look funky looking too. The fact that the ages of the Huon pines are estimated from pollen in a nearby lake means that the dates are based on many assumptions. Right? One scientist associated with that study actually noted that the media ran with the story before any confirmations could be done, and that's one of the problems in our. That's one of the problems in our lives of leaking of information. Right? When something there's a confirmation bias, and we have all over the world people in all kinds of scientific and political and religious. Parts of life that will leak information to the media to try to get it out to everybody as soon as there is some confirmation to their worldview without taking the time to prove it. It happens even with creationists. I know that I've in the past used evidences of creation as arguments in conversations only to find later that it wasn't fully proven, that that more studies showed, okay, that wasn't what we thought it was. And then I had to backtrack, right? And that happens. It happens to all of us because we all have a worldview, as we talked about the first couple of weeks. We all make assumptions from our worldview, and there's no way around that. We can look at the same piece of evidence, and our worldview tells us how to interpret that evidence. So, in this whole thing of evidence, we're not here to try to give you fodder to prove to an evolutionist or an atheist that the Bible is true. Evidence is great, but it's better for you to have evidence for what you believe, because you claim to be a Christian, you claim to believe the Bible, and this evidence is for you to be confident in your faith that you can believe that the Bible is true, because we have evidence to support our worldview. Okay? Alright, I'll keep moving. Almost done. We're going to get through it. What about living fossils? Has anybody heard that term before? Yeah, Pastor's heard it all. Living fossils are organisms that are present in nature today that are seemingly identical to their fossil ancestors. And this challenges the simple to complex evolution over millions of years model. Darwinian evolution predicts that the lowest level organisms on any of their trees that they make up, the lowest level organisms should be replaced over time. They should have changes in their body shape and their bodily function. They should evolve, right? So, what we see are thousands of organisms all over the world that don't seem to have evolved at all. And what they purport are hundreds of millions of years of time. And in that secular timeline, they should have, if they were a low enough population that they didn't need to evolve, they should have become extinct, according to the evolutionary model. There are some plant examples of living fossils. Pastor's favorite, ginkgo biloba, the sequoia, and the horsetail. All of these are virtually identical to what we found either tens of millions or hundreds of millions years of old in the evolutionary timeline in the record. So again, I bet you can guess whether living fossils cause evolutionists to second-guess the theory. What do you think, Denise? Does it? Does it cause them to second-guess anything? That looks like a maybe. Okay. So instead of coming to the right conclusion in the face of jarring evidence, evolutionists again adjust their belief, again move the goalpost. Instead of gradual change to accommodate, or instead of gradual change over millions of years, which is what has been preached for evolution all along, and yes, I use the word preached because it is a religion. The gradual change we saw with Stephen Gould is, there must be punctuated equilibrium. Most of the time it's gradual change, but there must also be punctuated equilibrium to jump from one kind of thing to another kind of thing. And now there must also be stasis. That somehow their theory has been made plastic enough to accommodate gradual change, rapid change, and no change. Okay.
The shoe fits every foot.
Right, the shoe has to fit every foot, right? Especially when there's no shoe. But it just shows how much faith they have to put in their chosen mythology and how badly, for the most part, they don't want to be accountable to God. Now, I will say that I think we should remember that though some evolutionists are what the Bible refers to as the fools who said in their hearts that there is no God, right? And others are formerly professing believers who just became disenchanted by the things of God or were drawn away. Just as Paul wrote in the verse at the bottom in 2 Timothy 4, he spoke of those who will not endure sound doctrine, who follow after their own lusts, who turn away their ears from the truth, and who are turned unto fables, right? Some are those who have been turned away. And then others are simply misled and bound by a prevailing false teaching. So we should exercise patience and discernment when we're speaking with other people about these topics. Like I said, this is great. This evidence is great to convince you that what you believe is really real, because you can have evidence for it. You don't have to just say, well, the Bible is true because I believe it. And then I believe it because the Bible is true. You don't need that. You don't need that sort of getting caught in a fallacious circular reasoning. You can actually provide evidence for why you believe what you believe, why your worldview is solid. But we need to, when we're speaking with friends and family about these things, we need to definitely pray for them. And we need to pray that the Lord leads us to say the right things at the right time, to be patient, and to be able to show the love of God instead of the judgment of man in each of those situations. So, pray that was half a blessing. Pray for us.
Sure. Lord, we